Today is March 11th, 2008. My name is Tony Hilliard. I'm with Mr. Dick Jackson. We're here at the Atlanta History Center to interview Mr. Jackson about his Vietnam experiences. Would you please tell us what your date of birth is and where you were born?
Yes, I was born February 15th, 1937. Just missed being a Valentine. My town was Huntington, West Virginia, and lived there and went to high school and college also in Huntington at Marshall University, which was recently a movie out on Marshall, We Are Marshall, which I was very proud of. That happened a few years after I left Marshall, however. And then left, after I graduated, I worked for a year with a company that was called Retail Credit, which is now Equifax, for a year as an insurance investigator, and then decided, after looking at all the posters out on the street corners and seeing the sign that the Marine Corps builds men, I decided that that was my destiny, that I needed to go in the Marine Corps and become a man. And even though there for a few years in college I thought I was one, I was soon to find out that I was just a shell of a man as far as the Marine Corps was concerned. So I joined the Marine Corps in March of 1960 and spent 8 years in the Marine Corps. I was commissioned a regular officer and left as a major. And came to Atlanta, Georgia after that.
Did you go directly to Vietnam or?
No, actually I went to Quantico, Virginia. I went through officer candidate training at Quantico, and then basic school, which was the dress-up school for officers. And then I stayed there for a year and a half and trained officer candidates for about 6 or 8 months. Played some football there, and then ended up being the track coach at Quantico for 2 years, which was a great experience because in those days, this was up until May of 1962, at Quantico, they would host the Marine Corps Schools Relays. And every year they brought in about 750 young athletes to participate in the relays. And it was one of the finest track events on the East Coast, probably in the country at that time. And the nice thing about it was all recruiting, because it was amazing how many people, after they graduated from college and had participated and had come to the relays, ended up coming into the officer candidate program at Quantico. So it was a great program. We ran against a lot of the finest schools in the country on the East Coast, and I had a chance to run for 1 year while I was there myself. But it was a great program. I spent 2 years there, left and went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And I'll go on with this to bring you up to the war, if you will.
Sure.
Reported in to a rifle company at Camp Lejeune, and was going through the normal training, etc., and so forth, all through the summer months. Was playing football also. And I played football for 4 years of college and basketball and ran track, so I was highly motivated. I liked athletics. And one morning I went to work. We played a football game on Saturday, and my battalion, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, was on alert at Camp Lejeune. And they always had a battalion on alert. It was just kind of, back in those days, prepared to undertake any contingency that might occur on the eastern half, in the eastern half of the United States, or the eastern half of the world, for that matter, from Camp Lejeune. And I went to work one morning, on a Sunday morning after playing football, pretty well beat up and sore. And as we were there going through our little drills and things, we got a telephone call. And they said to report to Cherry Point, load all of our gear, which was already packed, being on alert, which we'd been on for about 2 weeks. Everything, you're all packed up, you're ready to mount out on a minute's notice. They said, get your jeeps, get your trucks, get your troops, drive to Cherry Point, North Carolina. We thought, well, we're going through some sort of exercise. This is just to test our readiness. And so we drove to Cherry Point. I was the embarkation officer for our rifle company, didn't know anything about embarkation, and was making up loading plans in the Jeep, driving to Cherry Point to load our rifle company on 6 or 5 airplanes to mount out. Well, we thought, you know, this is a good exercise, this is fun. So we got over there, and we saw all these airplanes sitting on the strip. And we thought, well, really, this is going to be a realistic exercise, it looks like. And they started bringing out all these ammo and sea rations and other equipment, which had been stored since the Korean War. And they said, load this gear on your airplanes and figure out your manifest. That is, how many pounds you can put on the plane, plus how many troops you can put on. And you had to, so we had to figure this out. I'm trying to figure it out. Had zero amount of experience. But on-the-job training is interesting. When you're told, by God, you will do it. So I'm sitting there trying to figure it out, how to load these airplanes, 5 airplanes. And I noticed this equipment and this ammo. I called this major over, and I was the first lieutenant at the time, and I said, Major, I got a little problem here. I said, I'm looking at this ammo. And I picked up some of the ammo, the rounds, and I said, you see this ammo? I said, Major, I don't know where we're going, and I don't know even if we are going, but let me explain it. He was aviation. I'm infantry. And I said, Major, I said, you see this little round? I said, you see this rifle? Well, this little round won't go down this damn rifle barrel. It was 30 caliber ammo. The 30 caliber had already gone by the wayside, and we had 7.62, whatever, at that point in time. And he looked at me, and I said, and it's not going to work. Why am I loading this stuff? And he said, Lieutenant, he said, you get that crap loaded, and you get on that airplane, you get your ass out here and now. So I did not win a friend or influence anyone, but we did get on the plane, and we flew out. The entire battalion was airlifted, and once we were in the air, they finally told us where we were going. We were en route to Cuba and the Gitmo Crisis. Ooh. 1962. It was October the 18th. We flew all night. We landed in Florida to refuel, and we were on these planes that were called flying boxcars. That they were like a big boxcar, and they just shook all night long. And I have to say this, I said, Cuba, where's Cuba? What's going on in Cuba? And we really didn't know that much about it, you know. And I'll never forget laying on the sea rations that we had stored in the back of the airplane, and the ammo, which wouldn't fit in our rifles. I was laying there, and I kept thinking to myself, I've been in the Marine Corps now 2 years. I was a first lieutenant, executive officer of a rifle company, and a platoon commander, both jobs. And I kept thinking to myself, I wish to hell I'd studied harder. I wish to hell I had paid closer attention. Here we are, as we thought we were going into war. It was almost a war. And it was the first time, and I thought to myself, if I ever get another chance, I'm going to listen I'm going to learn everything I can while I'm in this man's Marine Corps from now on. This was one of the most important lessons in my life, and it would eventually save my life a few years later, and I'll talk about that point. Because after that experience, anytime I went to anything, I don't care what it was, I listened as hard as I could. I wanted to be prepared, not only for saving my life, but as a Marine Corps officer and platoon leader or company commander, you're responsible for another 50 or 200 men, and you know you can make some dumb decision, and you get a lot of people killed. Well, that was laying on my mind quite heavily. Nonetheless, we landed in Cuba, and that first night, I'll never forget, they were issuing equipment, and they were issuing ammo that we could use. Most of what we had on the plane was so old, even the grenades and stuff wouldn't go off. It had been stored for 10 years or however long in bunkers, and that had never even been looked at, and they just hauled it out. So anyway, as we got ready to move up into the positions up on the hills around Guantanamo Bay to put in a defense, we listened to John Kennedy's speech. And he spoke to the nation and told them that he had landed Marines in Cuba and what was going on there. And that's when we really found out just how serious the situation was. And we had no idea what really to expect. But long story short from that, we spent 2 months there in Cuba, dug fortifications, dug holes, put in holes, put up barbed wire, set up defensive positions all around Guantanamo in the hills. watched the ships offshore, our Navy ships that were prepared to start firing, and our thoughts were this. We said, you know, if we can live through the first 6 minutes, if it hits the fan, the old perennial, whatever hits the fan, it will not be evenly distributed. When it hits the fan, if we could live through the first 6 minutes, we could probably survive. And so we were digging our foxholes on the backside of the hills away from the enemy. And we could see the enemy digging across the fence. So all day long we're digging and they're digging, and the worst thing we had to come, as far as combat was concerned, or projectiles being thrown at us, where they threw oranges at us when we were out on patrol up near the fence. But we were digging in, and that soil, you know, that's volcanic rock. And the soil and the rock was so bad that using our little entrenching tools, which, you know, had a digging point about a spade about like that and a wooden handle, some of them would actually split right up the center. That ground, that granite, or the soil and just so strong, it split the shovel. And so we dug in and we dug and we dug and we dug, and then about 2 months later they said fill up the holes and go home. And literally, then they put us on a ship and took us home. But after that, of course, they put in a lot of fortifications. They were able, or Kennedy was able, to work around the crises, and I won't go into the history of that. And so they sent us back home. So that took care of my first couple of years in the Marine Corps. And from that time, after that, then there was a Mediterranean cruise. And I was a rifle company commander at Camp Lejeune, which was great for first lieutenant. We had a Mediterranean cruise where we went to the Med for 6 months to train and provide NATO forces for any contingency that might occur in the Mediterranean. Spent six months. Matter of fact, we spent the first 60 days at sea were on a ship. And you put 300 Marines or better, 600 Marines on a ship for 60 days without land, without women, without booze. It was like being in a war all by itself. But 60 days we sailed at sea because a Cyprus situation broke out in 1964, and we had to stay within 8-hour sailing time of Cyprus to go in and evacuate U.S. nationals. And that was quite an experience. And finally they allowed us to be making, and then we started making landings on some of the islands over there, Crete and some other places, and finally got some liberty. But that was quite an experience. 60 days at sea, I mean, it was just unbelievable. From there, I finally was transferred to Hawaii and spent 2 years in Hawaii, and was at Headquarters Battalion, Camp Smith, which is where Fleet Marine Force Pacific was located, commanding Marine General for the Pacific Forces, and also the Naval Command, SINCPAC. Spent 2 years there training Marines. The war started in '66, and I was in an operations position where I was able to read a lot of reports coming in, and I was training the troops there on jungle warfare. And we did have some jungle-like terrain there in Hawaii, on Oahu, and also learning a great deal about the dastardly booby traps and things that were being used in war. Because of being there at that headquarters, I was able to avail myself of all the reports that came in. I could read the after-action reports and combat reports of what was happening. Matter of fact, they had a parade there, and General Krulak, who they called the Brute in those days, and his son ended up being a commandant of the Marine Corps. And I think General Krulak is still a living, matter of fact, and lives in San Diego. And he was just a 5.5 feet 4 inch tall general with a huge voice. But when they had a parade in Hawaii, and the first Marines sent to Vietnam came from Kaneohe Bay, where they had a brigade of Marines. And that was in 1965, March of 1965. And when we had the big parade and all the military forces participated, General Krulak told me to put a red Jeep, and that was one of my functions. Whatever was going on, I kind of was able to do that. I mean, keep in mind, I was no big wheel, I was just a worker bee. But to get a red Jeep and put a big yellow sign on it and drive that in the parade and said, this Jeep represents the Marine Brigade now located in South Vietnam. And that was our entry in the parade. And the Army, of course, had a lot of people in the Navy and everything. That's all we had in the parade. Made a great statement, I thought. So I was there until 1966 at Camp Smith and requested duty to Vietnam. I just felt like I had to do it. I was a regular officer, and that's your job, to go places where there are hostilities. And so I requested transfer to Vietnam, South Vietnam, left there and reported to Vietnam in like October 1966 to start that tour. And I want to mention to you, I said that something that saved my life is that that decision I made on that airplane going to Cuba about trying to learn as much as I could. Well, I've been reading about the booby traps, and the booby traps probably was the worst weapon that could be employed in that war. No forewarning. You look back on what happened, and there was almost 60,000 casualties, 300,000 men wounded, one way or another. And the booby trap had a big impact. And not only did, from the point of view of the actual injury itself, but the fact that it was always in your mind. You just knew when you went out on patrol, you didn't know when you were going to step on one of those. And of course, in some of the cities, they had these sappers that threw grenades at people and demolitions and things of this nature, and and even would kill themselves by hurling their body with a grenade or something attached into a crowd or something. But the booby traps were terrible, and they could be with a single grenade. Some of them could be booby traps with a bomb. Maybe they dropped it, not exploded. Punji pits, which were the bamboo stakes that they would put in the ground, vertically inclined, and they would put little metal tips on them. In some cases, they would defecate on those to create infection. All you had to do was just pierce the foot, and that would take a soldier out or a Marine out of action. So I read a lot about those and made up my mind I needed to know everything I could about booby traps. And on my way to Vietnam, we stopped at Camp Pendleton to go through a transplacement battalion and additional month of training. I knew I was, being infantry, I knew I was going to end up with a rifle company at some point in time when I got there. And they had a course there, a mock booby trap course. And I found this course, and we were going through training, and I stayed on this course 2 days, just back and forth, trying to locate, trying to understand the booby trap deployment, understand how to defuse them. And they wouldn't blow up on you, but they would crack, snap, crackle, and pop, and they could burn your hand, your finger, or something like that. But trying to learn how to find them, and then when you did find them, how to disarm them to where they would not go off. And I remember one night exactly staying there when all the other officers secured, and they went to the officer club to have a drink. Well, I don't know, I was just bound and determined, obsessive compulsive. I'll stay there and learn as much about it as I could. Now, fast forward about 4 months. I have a rifle company. I'm on patrol in Vietnam. I'm on patrol, search and destroy mission. We're going through a village. My radio operator is right behind me. And I'm walking down this little trail, and we've got troops spread out all over the place, sweeping through this village, trying to locate the enemy. In this case, it was the Viet Cong. This was south of, in the southern part of I Corps area, where the Marines were located, near the Qua Viet River, which was a river that went down to Dong Ha. And we're walking along, and I'm going to describe this, and I hear a click. And right in the middle of nowhere. And I heard this click, and my instinct was to look down. And I looked down, and under the toe of my right foot, jungle boot, I could see a little monofilament line, or fish line, bluish fish line. Saw that line, I looked over and there was a bush on the side of the trail. And it looked funny. You know, how does a bush look funny? It looked different. And I could see a little bit of plastic covering down around the bottom of the bush. Well, sometimes you see a lot of plastic out there in the wood because they would wear this plastic for raincoats and they just pull it over and wear it. And I turned to my radio operator who was right behind me and I said, "Red, run!" And I pushed him. And we took off running. This white phosphorus grenade exploded behind us. White phosphorus is the stuff that if you get on, it gets on you, it burns until it burns itself out. And more importantly, the only way you can put it out is to put dirt or something on it to seal the air. So it explodes, hits me on the back of my flak jacket, hits me on the top of my canteen and burns it on the little spot between my jacket and my cartridge belt, burns the canteen, hits my radio operator just one little spot on his leg. And I grabbed a handful of sand and stuff and dirt and just crammed it down on his leg to stop the fire, the burn. All this happened in about 7 seconds. Because once the grenade is triggered, the explosive time is 6 to 8 seconds before it will explode. And the killing radius is up to about 8 to 10 meters. We just got that happened that quick. To this day, now I know that I had a guardian angel up there looking after me, maybe 4 or 5. But I also know that I was so in tune with this booby trap stuff and so sensitive to it that anything that was abnormal, it just seemed to catch me. I had forced myself into it, to the mindset, stemming all the way back to those days on flying on that airplane. That and that was something that we made our company focus on as far as how locating, and I'll talk about that in a minute, as far as locating booby traps and locating any kind of explosive devices. Matter of fact, our company, which is documented in a book that I wrote about a device we use to find booby traps and to other devices that could kill you or harm you. We had located over 400 plunging pits during about a 3.5, 4 month period in our tactical area of operations using this device I'm going to talk about in a minute. And the 60 spider traps, 60 or 40 spider traps, which is where they've dug into the ground and all you can see looks like a bush and they're hidden in there. 400 punji pits, which any of those could have, I won't say killed, but it could have injured somebody. Numerous weapons, grenades. We found over almost 50 NVA and VC that were attributed to this device I'm going to talk about, that were either killed or captured during these sweeps that we made through our area of operation. And on one side of our zone of action, we would face the NVA. That would be on the north side of the river, towards the DMZ. We were only about 5,000 meters from the DMZ. That was the NVA. If we went south of that river, which was the delimiting point, it was Viet Cong. 2 different types of enemy, and they fought differently. And the NVA were a lot more tenacious. They had weapons that were far superior. And the VC were more of a ragamuffin group that didn't have proper. Matter of fact, a lot of the weapons that they had that we faced were American weapons, or even World War II weapons. The NVA, on the other hand, they had the great rifle, they had that automatic rifle, and they were well equipped, and they were, as I said, they were about as tenacious as a fighter of any I've ever seen in my life, and they would fight to the death. The VC would give up. But the NVA, it was hard to capture them once you found them. If they didn't find you, and some of them found us. But the point I'm getting to is that getting back to this issue about trying to fight our war in our little area, our zone of action was along the coast, the South China Sea. We were supposed to provide protection for an offloading area where they would bring in all the supplies and equipment that was going into the northern part of the Marine Corps I-Corps area. All ammo, sea rations. Now they did sea lift, I mean that was a sea lift, but they also did some airlifting. So we had a base right there on the South China Sea that was on the Dong Ha River, and the river went in down into Dong Ha, called Cam Lo, and down to the Dong Ha, Cam Lo, that area. And we were at what was called Qua Viet River. Qua Viet flowed from the South China Sea down into Dong Ha and on into the mountains. Over near Camp Carroll and some of those other famous military bases that had a lot of action. So we were supposed at this point in time provide protection and at the same time patrol aggressively from the DMZ south almost 10,000 meters. Huge, huge area. But the nice thing about it is they gave us Amtraks for transportation, and also the Amtraks were used from time to time to offload from the ships when they came up to bring them. In addition to that, we had an RMK construction company that we were providing protection for, who were opening the front of the river, dredging in there, so they could get the ships in and offload them on shore. And there were a couple of sunken ships right there, small boats, right there at the entrance of the Qua Viet River and the South China Sea that had been hit by NVA demolitions. And every morning I could get up and I could look right across the river and I could see one with a great big black hole in the side of it. A constant reminder that they were there, or they could get you if you let your guard down. That big black hole staring at us. So our job then was to provide protection for the engineers, to make sure that the area was not overrun, and it was important also to ensure that we never got mortared. Because with everything else that was in that area, we also had over 500,000 gallons of aviation gas stored on top of the ground in these containers that were just like not leather, but material, made out of material. And we knew that if a grenade or a mortar round hit one of those containers carrying with all that avgas, aviation gas, we would be poof, we'd be gone. It would just go up. The whole thing would go. So we had motivation to patrol hard and put a lot of ambushes out. And we had the Amtraks that could take us. We had a huge area to control. And we'd take the Amtraks out, they'd drop us off. We would sweep back towards our area. Once we swept as long as we could, time to start getting dark, Amtraks would take us, we'd use them as a blocking force, get back on them, go back to the beach, drive up the beach, and we always stayed on the beach.
You may want to describe an Amtrak.
Well, an Amtrak was an amphibious vehicle that could go in water or on land. It was like a tank, and some of them had 105 howitzers mounted on them, self-propelled howitzers, and they would hold about 25 troops. And a lot of times in movies, you'll see these big metal monsters coming off the ramps of these ships, and they go down in the water, and then they float up, and they have a low silhouette, and then they take troops to shore for an amphibious landing. So that's what we had. And so we go down the beach and come back to the beach, primarily because they couldn't mine the beach too well, and we didn't ever hit. They'd set off small explosions like grenades and stuff, but nothing big. So they would haul us back and forth, and we would use them as part of our blocking force when we were sweeping, to sweep the enemy towards the Amtraks. But we needed those to get around in. I mean, it was just, otherwise we couldn't have done the job.
What time frame is this now? Time frame?
This was like in January 1967 up to about May 67.
Okay.
And so anyway, we had a hard time finding the enemy. And we knew that they were there. There were a lot of small villages around, as we talked with some of the villages at that point in time, they were, they were neither hostile to us or too friendly, but they were glad we were there. And they would tell us to an extent, yes, the VC are here, they're trying to get soldiers out of the village, they're trying to make us give them food and things of that nature. But we couldn't find them. And the reason we couldn't find them is they were hiding in the ground, tunnels and so forth in the ground. So we knew, as a matter of fact, on one particular operation, we could hear them talking, and we couldn't find them. They're literally in a big mound, and we heard some voices, and we couldn't quite put it together. Well, where is that? What is that? Finally, we decided we needed to get some sticks because we were in sandy soil along the South China Sea. And we got sticks, and we sharpened the sticks and started using the sticks to kind of probe the earth.
That's a perfect timing.
So we were probing the earth with the sticks, and we found a couple of little holes, and we found some punji pits where you'd hit that soil and go right through, but the sticks would break. So we said, yeah, we gotta find a better way. We know now that what we've got to have in order to find these guys, because they are hiding from us. They could hear the motors of the Amtraks coming, and they would conceal themselves, and then when we leave, they'd come back out and they'd do their indoctrination of the villages or whatever. So we thought we need steel, something that won't bend, good strong steel. So we were going to send some of our troops, and the nice thing about it, I was so far away, we were on our own, by ourselves, I had total control, and all I had to do was check into battalion and let them know what we were doing that day. And make sure we got resupplied with ammo and rations and things of that nature. But I didn't have anybody there, so we could kind of it was the best of all worlds and the worst of all worlds. Because I liked it so much that later on when I got in business, I liked being in control, and I liked being my own boss, that I had a difficult time adjusting to some people here in the land that I work for, because I like to do it myself. I got spoiled, and it worked. I mean, what we were doing worked. So nonetheless, we finally realized that we had steel on our position. What we had was because we had the Amtraks, they had 105s mounted on them. They fired this big round, and we used them for interdiction fires at nighttime. You'd fire on different locations to keep the enemy from infiltrating, or you'd pick out logical places on a map that you thought would be where they might accumulate, or stage up to conduct an attack. And maybe every hour you drop a round on that, and that could be 2 or 3 miles away. So we were using these as our very standard process during the Vietnam War. At nighttime, all night long, you'd fire these interdiction fires. Harassment and interdiction fires, they were called. Well, we found that they had some ammo boxes there for those rounds, and those rounds were about that big, about that long, about so big, about that long. And lo and behold, in those ammo boxes, there were 2 metal stakes, if you will, about 1/3 of an inch round that held the rounds in place. And every night, they would fire 10 boxes of ammo, 3 rounds in a box, at least. So there's, two steel rods. Those rods, interesting enough, were about that long in the box. So we said, well, wait a minute, that's our steel. That's what was the perfect size. So we started getting those metal rods. And then we decided, well, they got to be longer. So we cut bamboo handles, bamboo sticks about so long, and we taped those handles on those metal rods. Then we said, now we got to get them sharpened so that they'll go into the ground. So we went over to the RMK Construction Company group of men who had all kinds of tools and lathes and everything else, and we said, guys, we need your help. And they said, Lieutenant, Captain, they said, look, you're saving our ass. We'll do anything for you want. What do you want done? Because they weren't fighters, they were workers. and our job was to protect them. We said we need real good points put on these metal rods where they'll pierce the ground, the sandy soil. And they sharpened all these rods. So when we were finished with that little job, we now had about 200 of these spikes made up about so long. We equipped every man in the rifle company with a spike. And when we went on patrol, we were using that spike, checking the ground ahead that we went. And I'll give you an example in a minute how effective it was. And therefore we were locating punji sticks, punji pits, we were locating armed devices and things by using this thing, sticking it in the ground, and it was kind of funny. Here's 200 Marines out there, look like they're walking along, you know, with the security patrols out, plunging these poles into the ground. We called it the Mike Spike, after Mike Company, because the name of the company is Mike Company, 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines. We got a lot of notoriety about this because we had great success with it. On one particular operation, we were so successful, and my troops loved it. I mean, they loved it because it was unique. We called ourselves the Snoopy Poopers. We had a patch made up with Snoopy, with a Mike Spike in his hand and a helmet and gat like that, and the Snoopy Poopers on it, and it had these patches made up, and every man would wear a patch on his utility. They wouldn't let us sew them, so we'd have to pin them on our pocket when we went out on the sweep. But it was great morale, and men took great pride in being part of a unit that was having success, and we were acknowledging that success, and as was our leaders in the rear acknowledging the success. One afternoon, we were on a patrol, and the commanding general of the 3rd Marine Division, General Kyle, flew out. About 3 choppers landed right behind us as we were out sweeping through this area that was primarily rice paddies. Well, rice paddies were a neat place for them to hide because they had the, in between each paddy, they had a big chunk of dirt, a big hunk, you know, that would separate the paddies, and it could be 8 or 9 feet high. And General Kyle lands, and he came. I went back, saluted him, did my thing, yes sir, and blah blah blah. And I immediately began to explain what we were doing, exactly what was going on. He said, "Well, I want to come up here and watch this." He said, "I keep reading all these situation reports about what you're all doing. I want to see this and how you use it." So we're out there now. We have rice paddies, and we got these big mounds that separate the rice paddies, and we got 150 troops going up this area, checking out the sides, the rice paddies, the rice dikes, and so forth. And General Kyle standing there with me, and I'm explaining to him how we work, and I'm explaining to him how we run these operations, and kind of interesting, and it's different, very different. And all of a sudden, we look up. I said, "Well, you see that Marine up there?" And he was sticking his pipe down in this big mound of the dike, of the rice dike. And I said, "You see, he's trying to locate and see if there's a hole there, a crevice, an opening, or something that would give way." And we're watching him, and I'm giving him this explanation. I'm talking to him about how our operations are run and how we do it. And all of a sudden, we're watching him, and he rams the spike down in the ground, and he tries to pull it up, and it won't come up. And so I'm standing there, and I'm watching, and so he's pulling on it, it won't come up. And he hollers at another Marine to come over. The other Marine comes over, and they both grab it, and they pull it. And when they pull it, the dirt just flies up, a little wooden top door, about like that, flips out of the ground, and a Viet Cong comes up out of the ground, holding on to the spike. And when I'm standing with the general, we're not 50 feet away. I said, "Sir, I believe you better go to the rear." I said, "Man, I think I ought to go to the rear too." And so I got him back there, and back behind there was all the choppers and all the colonels and lieutenant colonels and everybody else, his entourage. What had happened was when the Marine was probing the rice dike, and he was going down, we got to VC, we captured him. We took great pride because we captured a lot of VC and NVA. We tried to take them because they always had valuable information, and if we could indoctrinate them, or if we could talk to them and get information out of them. Of course, we'd use that for the next operation, and we did, because we had Vietnamese people with us, interrogators with us, and we got a lot of information, found a lot of other stuff. But when he was probing into the ground, when we got the NVA up out of the ground, VC up out of the ground, we could see these scratch marks down his back. Now imagine what's going on. Here's this VC down in his hole with a little wooden top covered with dirt. And interesting enough, a lot of times when you would find these in a village or in a location, there'd be human excrement on top of where the hole was, where the door was. And that was another way to conceal it. And so anyway, they would do all kinds. So anyway, when he's probing down, what had happened, you could see these big red whelps down his back. He'd actually scratched his back twice. It had scraped the skin off his back. I mean, he was bleeding. So here's this VC in this hole, and he's watching, and he's looking up, and what he sees is this spike about so long, metal spike, coming down through the hole. And he's watching this thing, and you know, and it's here, and it's here, and it's here, and finally, it came down and scratched him a couple of times, tore the skin off his back, and finally he just grabbed a hold of it. And when they pulled, he came right up out of the ground. And that was the effect. It was a weapon. It was an absolute weapon. And even Hanoi Hannah even talked about it. We heard it on the radio a couple of times. They were sending troops down. They were going to wipe out my company, 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, and we relished in that, you know. But that was a device that was employed. It mimics the old saying, if it's stupid but works, it ain't stupid. And everybody in the world would have thought that's the most stupid thing you could do, but it was the right thing at the right time, and the team came together to utilize that thing and utilize it effectively. And we won our little war during that time period. Now, we got hell beat out of us a couple of times. We got blasted a few times without question, but there was a time period there that we just absolutely were in control using that mic spike. And then they finally relieved us. They took us back to Okinawa for R&R. We were pretty well beat out.
As a unit?
Pardon me?
As a unit,
the entire battalion, because you rotate out after 6 or 8 months. And took us back. We the battalion was torn up. It had seen a lot of action, and had several men who won the Congressional Medal of Honor. One of the great medals that they were involved in, it was called Mutter's Ridge. And 2 men got the Congressional Medal of Honor, and a captain and a sergeant, and just alone in that. Several Navy Crosses. A highly decorated unit. A lot of battle, a lot of fighting. And they took us back, and we were back there, and I guess once we went back, I probably had 75% turnover, and that's when they would give you new gear, replenish your gear. New troops would come in, and we were supposed to be there for like 10 weeks or something like that, and then we were there for just a short period of time, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, and still had not gotten everything put back in good shape. And they said, back to Vietnam. It was the largest at that point in time. This was like May of 1967. It was the largest airlift ever conducted in the Vietnam War, and they flew out the entire battalion back, sea lift and airlift, because they were conducting a major operation up in the DMZ. The NVA had come across the DMZ, the military zone, and they were coming south. And what we were doing a bilateral operation with the South Vietnamese, about 6 or 7 battalions, and we were trying to catch the NVA that had crossed into South Vietnam, and block them and sweep south and into another blocking force, and try to capture them, and they'd come right out of the DMZ, through the DMZ. So they threw us back the first night back into Dong Ha. They have us assembled on an airstrip, and we were to fly out the next morning, helicopters, and land into DMZ, and that's where our battalion was going to start from, and we were going to sweep south. That night, about midnight, we were hit heavily by rocket fire, and probably lost about 40 or 50 men. And we were all bunched up on this airstrip, and they knew we were coming. And it's kind of always, I never really liked to do operations with the South Vietnamese because we said, well, we don't know whether they're with us or against us. But we were all bunched up on it and ready to go the next morning because at daylight we had to get on those choppers and fly. And that was, you know, so anyway, we lost a bunch of men that night. And the next day, we flew into the DMZ. I had the lead company to land in the DMZ, and because I was the only experienced rifle company commander that the new colonel of our new battalion commander had said, so you got to take the lead. I said, I got all new troops. And so we flew in, and I thought we were going to take 50% casualty. I just knew we would take 50% casualty. We were going right into a village that was right in the center of the DMZ, right on the Ben Ha River. I said, how can we not just be, they're just going to tear us apart. It was interesting because when we landed, we didn't take but just a few rounds. And my first objective was to move down, set up the landing area, and provide security for that so the rest of the troops could come in. And as more choppers landed, then you keep expanding and expanding and expanding, and pretty soon you're through expanding and you take off with your mission. It's a very delicate operation. So we went down the road towards this village that we were told was a regimental headquarters, and that expect heavy concentration of enemy. When I got to the edge of the village, you could see there was heavily fortified, huge fortifications. I mean, huge trees dug in, and so I said, well, let's just call in. I'm going to call in supporting artillery. I called in every bit of artillery I could get on that village. They fired and fired and fired. I used mortars to call mortars in. When I was finished with that, I called in air. Bombs, 500-pound bombs. Then I called, I said, is there anything left on station that I can get? And he said, well, we've got 2 jets that's carrying the Willie Peter or the napalm. I said, I want them. So these jets came in and dropped their tanks across this village with the napalm, and it just went up in fire. When that was finished, I said, okay, launch the attack. Now, we hadn't taken any fire to speak of, but I'm going on what my intelligence told me. So we stepped off into the attack, what we thought was the attack. And as we went in, we got no fire whatsoever, limited rifle fire from a few spaces, and proceeded to go through that village and check out all those bunkers. We pulled 135 civilians that were hiding in the bunkers. Not one of them had been touched by this huge firestorm that I had called in on that village, to give you some idea of how well they could dig into the ground and fortify this thing with logs and timbers and dirt. Not one casualty. 135 civilians. It blew my mind. But what it was a regimental. It was a regimental headquarters, but it was a head hospital. Okay. And we found all kinds of medical equipment. Some of them, I mean, it was to look at. I mean, saws for amputation, silver saws and things that they use. Which, I mean, it was the crudest stuff you could think of. I mean, you looked at it compared to what I'd like to think that our men would be treated with. Blew up a couple of huge ammo dumps that were just unbelievable. I mean, and I guess lots of rice. I mean, several thousand pounds of rice. Couldn't even get the rice out of there. The choppers couldn't fly in because of the heat. It was so hot, so we had to burn the rice, which was bad. I mean, it was a huge supply point. But it did not have the enemy troops that we thought. And then we moved after we had finished with that operation. Then we moved south. It was shortly after that, just a few days later, that I was relieved. I'd spent my 6-7 months in command and left the unit and went back to regimental headquarters and spent the last several months at the regimental headquarters as in the operations area at Third Marine Division headquarters. And once that was over, then that time was completed. Then I came back to the United States and decided that I would become a civilian. And I talked about writing this book about my experiences, which everything that I talked about here today was pretty much
hold it up so we can see the cover.
Was it's called Yesterdays Are Forever. I read a passage
Hold it up just
through the Marine Corps and Vietnam War. And when I decided to write this book in 1999, I felt I needed to write it to get this stuff out of my system to some extent, although I don't want to pretend that I was a wounded duck when I came back at all. I was fortunate. Did not get any wounds, and I think mentally I was in decent shape, although I think all of us probably suffered a little bit when we first came back. But I wrote this book, and I had to get it out, and it seemed like when I started on, I wrote for 2 years. And it was the most damnedest thing I've ever gone through in my life, because I'd be writing on it. It just seemed like I would complete a section or a chapter, write exactly where I needed to complete it, which led right into the very next thing. And so it was done in chronological order. And it was the most amazing thing. And I would describe things that went on. I would describe weapons and in some detail and military things that people would say, "How could you remember this after 30 years? How could anybody remember this stuff?" And I said, "I don't know." But I remembered things that were said. I remember things I said. I remember things that went on and happened. I would go and get into weapons and describe how weapons operated still. Areas, and all I had no notes. I had a map. Had my map of the area I operated in. And but most of the book is about Vietnam, probably 2/3. The other third is about some of the earlier experiences, about making a Marine Corps officer, I guess, to some extent.
There's about 10 minutes left for the hour.
Okay. And so anyway, that book helped me a lot, I think, to get it out. And then later on, I wrote another book, 2 other books, both of which I've incorporated some Marine Corps experiences in. One was called Too Stupid to Quit, Banking and Business Lessons Learned the Hard Way. And I used a lot of stories and illustrations from the war and the Marine Corps and lessons learned and how they were principles that applied to business as well as being in the military. Wrote a book recently called On the Edge, Wilderness Adventures, and I compared a lot of things that we'd done on expeditions over a 25-year period while I was in the banking business here in Atlanta, on these expeditions that we took across America, and I would compare a lot of things we would do there as how it might compare as done in a combat situation, eating, setting up campsites, hiking, using military, and it was interesting because it all related. Every bit of it related. It was so intriguing to me to find just how it related. So I'd have to say, after having gone through all this, and I could probably tell a bunch more stories, which I will not try to bore anybody to death with those, but I would say that to me, probably the best thing that happened to me was I was able to get this stuff out and talk about it. And I still talk about it, and I still give speeches about it, and I lecture on it, and I talk about these principles and how they're applicable to about just living life in general. And so I'd have to say the Marine Corps must have had a great experience, a great impact on me. The experiences were significant, and I owe a lot to having had the opportunity to be an officer in the Marine Corps, go through the training, and I guess for me, and maybe this is a good way to end this thing, for me, I'd have to use the old Marine Corps adage, once a Marine, always a Marine. And that's Richard D. Jackson. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you sharing your experience with us, and thank you for your time, and thank you for your service. And
thank you for your service.
okay. There we go. And